Ari Rosenbaum here with another fun-filled episode of that 4K podcast. This week's topic, we're going to talk about what plan sponsors can't withhold from their plan providers. You know, the little nuances of information that stop plan providers, especially TPAs, from doing their jobs, which is an important aspect when you're hiring these providers to do their job. But of course, first things first, go to that 401ksite.com. Information about all our events, Chicago, Denver. And if you go to YouTube, you can check out the presentations that you might have missed from that national 401k that 401k national virtual conference. Books are available on Amazon for Kindle and paperback. That's Full Circle and that 401k plan provider handbook. So let's get to the topic at hand. If you've read Full Circle, which is that book that came out in June, which is probably the last time I will, bring up personal issues in a book. It's kind of like my little bow about my life and business and whatnot, and kind of the stuff that I had to deal with. An important aspect of the book was, growing up with very domineering parents. They were very judgmental. Um, you know, that's how narcissists were. And I really learned um, that withholding information from them gave me that little small thing of peace. Withholding how badly maybe I was doing in high school when I didn't really put in the effort. And it wasn't truly healthy. It wasn't right. Um, and that sets you up sometimes in life when you're older and you're trying to hide things, and that's not necessarily something that you should be doing. And it really felt necessary at the time. Um, you know, I think I had a chapter title where it's like I lied, but it was only to protect myself. But the problem is that I felt it was necessary at the time, but that instinct doesn't disappear just because you become a responsible adult, a business owner, or a 4K plan sponsor. Um, you know, it just changes form. And there are a lot of times that plan sponsors withhold information from their plan providers, sometimes intentionally, sometimes, not. Sometimes because no one ever asked them about it, which, happens because maybe they have a TPA that isn't really, on the ball and aware of what they should be doing. And, I had, I was working at a TPA, and we had a company, a plan sponsor client. We helped them on their 401k plan. The company was headed by a very well-known former mayor of a large metropolitan area, and we did such a great job. I believe I think actually we're doing work on their DB plan, and we did such a great job. They wanted us to work on their 401k plan, and we said, "What 401k plan?" That happens a lot. They don't mention other retirement plans. They don't mention related companies because they weren't asked, and you know they don't raise red flags about anything that changes with ownership or any payroll quirks. They think that silence equals simplicity. But the problem is that withholding information doesn't create peace. I saw that firsthand in my life. I see that in this business as an ERISA attorney. Silence doesn't help. Withholding information um, doesn't create peace of mind. It just merely delays the consequences. And when it comes to retirement plans, consequences um, don't necessarily come from your TPA or other plan provider. They come from the IRS, the DOL, and there's so much, you know, stuff that plan sponsors can't afford to withhold. One of the most dangerous myths in the 401k plan space is that plan sponsors can certainly outsource their responsibility. They can outsource administration. They can outsource testing. They can outsource filing. You cannot outsource the truth. Your plan provider can only work with the facts you give them. My mother-in-law, may she rest in peace, We used to call her half a story Esther. She would just go on, and she would give you the whole story. Um, and many plan sponsors are like that. They're half a story. And you can only work, your plan provider can only work with the facts that they're given. If you're withholding something, if you're giving them half a story, they can't fully do their jobs, and they want to do their jobs. Most, at least the good ones, do. If facts are incomplete, outdated, or just absolutely wrong, the provider's work product is going to reflect that. As I always say, garbage in, garbage out. When the IRS and DOL comes knocking on the door, they don't ask why. What did your TPA know, and when did they know it? They will merely fall on you, the plan sponsor. You failed to disclose. You withheld. That's a problem. And of course, the other retirement plan situation. The most common omission out there is, plan sponsors failing to disclose other retirement plans sponsored by the employer or related employers. It may include profit sharing plan, cash balance plan, DB plans, but most of the time it includes SEP IRAs or simple IRAs. And you could also even have terminated DB plans that have some issues. Sponsors have this kind of weird notion that separate, these plans are separate because they were using a different provider. They were set up years ago and they cover different employees, but it doesn't really matter. For IRS purposes, these plans are usually aggregated for testing, for coverage, non-discrimination testing, contribution limits, top heavy. Withholding information about other plans can cause serious, failed ADP, ACP testing, incorrect allocation formulas, excess contributions, disqualification risk, and an audit where a plan sponsor didn't think it was relevant, and that's the problem. The silent killers when dealing with plan sponsors is control group and affiliated service groups. If there's one area where not knowing will not save you, it's control group and affiliated service group rules. Plan sponsors routinely fail to disclose common ownership of multiple companies, family attribution issues, professional service relationships, and shared management or back office functions. The control groups are kind of easy in terms of numbers and stock ownership. Affiliated service group determinations are much harder. The bar in terms of common ownership is that much lower, and it's not cut and dry. It's based on facts and circumstances. The rules are complicated. Even the control group rules. Who's which children are over the 21 and over, that kind of stuff. You know, uh, but they're complex. But complexity is not an excuse, and inconvenience is not a defense. If companies are part of a control group, they are treated as one employer for retirement plan purposes. That affects eligibility, vesting, coverage, testing, top-heavy status, and contribution limits. And when plan sponsors withhold ownership or relationship information, intentionally or not, the plan provider may test the plan incorrectly. The years later, the IRS or DOL deconstructs the truth, and suddenly the plan has systematic failures going back multiple plan years. That's not peace. That's a compliance time bomb. And right now, I'm working on a new client where it's a restaurant chain and they didn't include a couple of the restaurants. That's a problem. That's a huge issue. Next, with the withholding problem, payroll and compensation data. You can't, like I said, just like I always say, garbage in, garbage out. Plan providers live and die by payroll data. That's a fact. If the data is wrong, the plan is wrong. So information sponsors often fail to disclose, the information that, sponsors often fail to disclose are something like, bonuses, deferred comp arrangements, equity compensation. There may be independent contractors that are classified, changes in the payroll vendors, and mid-year compensation definition changes. Sometimes this happens involuntarily. HR and payroll don't talk to finance. Sometimes it's willful. We didn't want to complicate the plan. But the IRS doesn't care about your internal silos. Incorrect compensation data can lead to missed deferrals, incorrect employer contributions, operational failures requiring correction, and DOL claims for lost earnings. Your provider cannot fix what they don't know exists. And that's a fact. And outside of late deferrals, I always say that the biggest problem right now is payroll data. It's just a hot mess. Um, you know, Next, ownership and corporate changes. The will tell you later mistake. Mergers, acquisitions, spin-offs, and ownership changes are, disclosed to accountants and lawyers, but not to the plan providers. That's a complete and utter mistake. Plan sponsors frequently fail to report new owners, investors, buy-sell agreements, partial asset sales, equity entity conversions, and changes in EIN usage. And these problems, these events can certainly trigger plan termination or successor plan issues, vesting acceleration, coverage testing failures, and inaccurate Form 5500s. You know, you may get a plan sponsor that says, "Oh, by the way, yeah, we bought that company 3 years ago," and you just sit there and you're like, "That's a problem." You have 3 years of incorrect testing. There may be corrective contributions you have to make. One of the jokes I always had with my family, I was the last to know anything. Even in where I worked, sometimes I used to joke that the problem with certain places, I always swore. I think I had that joke when I was working with CEVAs, whatever. I said one day they'll just close down the doors and they won't let us know. But I was always the last to know anything. At least that's how I feel. And unfortunately, when it comes to retirement plans, it's the plan providers who are the last to know anything, and that's a problem. Some information again is withheld because sometimes plan sponsors hope the problem is going to disappear, and it won't. Late deferral deposits, use of forfeitures contrary to plan terms, failure to follow eligibility rules, informal plan amendments, and selective employer contributions. Sponsors think that if we tell the provider, it becomes official. That mindset really is, truly backwards. It becomes official when the DOL finds it. Early disclosure allows correction through the IRS and DOL voluntary programs. Late disclosure turns correctable errors into penalties, excise taxes, and fiduciary liability. We see that with control group. How many plans get disqualified because they didn't, they didn't cover the employees that they were supposed to. That's a problem. And I knew guy wasn't a family member, but I heard of somebody who had, I want to say, testicular cancer, or prostate or whatever, and the guy was young, and it was like, oh well, let him get married, and it's that kind of idea. You have a problem, and you try, ignoring it is not going to make it better, especially in the plan space, where when you have like a testing failure on ADP, you can make a corrective QNAC, and if you fix it years later, I'm sorry, you could do refunds, and you fix it years later, and all you could do are QNACs, and it becomes very expensive. And another area of withholding information is employee classification. Plan sponsors often fail to disclose to their plan providers about rehired employees, long-term part-time employees, leased employees, employees working for related entities, and independent contractors who should be employees. Plan providers really need accurate information on service and classification data to determine eligibility investing. Garbage in, garbage out. When plan sponsors withhold or misunderstand this information, participants lose benefits, and that's when lawsuits could happen. Voluntary versus involuntary withholding. The IRS doesn't really care. The IRS doesn't care if you withheld information because you didn't understand the rules, you assumed it wasn't relevant, you didn't want to be judged, you wanted to avoid costs or complications. The result is the same. The IRS and DOL don't grade on emotional context, they grade on compliance. When I was younger, I I knew the instinct to withhold. I lived it and I rationalized it. In the end, I always got caught. Didn't really matter. And I learned painfully that, avoidance doesn't create safety. Transparency always does. My parents were narcissists. If I would have told them I got in my 80s anyway, they would have told me what a loser I was. Um, by withholding the information, I didn't avoid a greater harm. It was always the same harm. They claimed it was more harm because I lied, but telling these people the truth when they live and die by your GPA, it just doesn't help. But you learn that now, and with my kids, try the best they can. I don't live and die by their grades. Um, my role in life, what I've done in life, and the achievements I've made aren't changed if my kids get like a D average in college. It doesn't change what I did and I accomplished, but I'm not that insecure like my parents were. But what plan sponsors really have to do instead of withholding is, you know, over disclose to the plan provider, let them decide relevance. That's their job. If it's useless information, they'll tell you. Conduct annual ownership and entity reviews. Don't assume last year's structure still applies. Always disclose it on the census information when they give you that end of the year data sheet to fill out. It's important to integrate HR, payroll, finance, and benefits. Silos create compliance failures. Ask control group questions proactively. Silence is not neutrality, it's risk. And treat your provider as a partner and not just some vendor. Vendors process, partners protect. And like I said in that book, I talk about withholding information and gave me temporary peace, but long-term consequences. The same is true for 401k plans. You can hide from your provider. You cannot hide from regulators. And when the truth finally surfaces, and it always does, it's rarely gentle. The goal of a retirement plan isn't perfection, it's compliance, integrity, and trust. That starts with telling the whole story, even the parts that feel inconvenient, embarrassing, or complicated. Uh, Especially those parts, because silence doesn't protect you. It just really postpones the day of reckoning. And that's really how I see it. Do not withhold. Um, it's just, what's the point of it? You're just going to create a greater harm for yourself. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of that 401k podcast. Like I said, go to that 401ksite.com, sign up for all the other events that we got there listed. And the books are available on Kindle and paperback. That would be Full Circle and that 401k Plan Provider Handbook. And tune in next week for another fun-filled episode of that 401k podcast. Take care. Bye.